Hello coaches, welcome back to another Modern Soccer Coach interview. This week David Tenney joins us, High Performance Director at Austin FC MLS and also a student and now a trainer at the Tactical Periodization School in Portugal, Vitor Frade's school. Phenomenal insight around what is tactical periodization, how can you implement it, and why should you be thinking about it a little bit different. There's a ton of stuff in this. You're going to love it. Thanks so much for the support. Before we start, please make sure you like, please make sure you subscribe. Don't forget all the resources of Modern Soccer Coach. Thank you so much for the support. Here's David. Enjoy.
David, thank you so much for joining me today. Got you back on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It's been a while, but yeah, it's great. Yeah, look forward to talking.
Probably the most fascinating areas for coaches is this area of tactical periodization. It's probably shaped the landscape considerably over the last 10 years, but whereas probably 5 years ago, if we did this interview, I would have got into terms and definitions, but I think now I want to kick this off with what the difference is in a lot of coaches, which I'm sure you'd agree, feel as if they do tactical periodization, but for them it's not necessarily the same thing. So what's the difference in having your game model and then going and planning that out with the physical, that's traditional coaching today, versus true tactical periodization as you know it?
Yeah, I think, first, thanks for having me on, and and having the opportunity to discuss this, because I do think there's this false stigma that tactical periodization, as a coach comes in, he's got this very well-defined game model, and then on Monday we're going to do recovery, and on Tuesday we're going to do strength, and on Wednesday we're going to do endurance, and on Thursday we're going to do speed, and on Friday we're going to do a activation, and then on Saturday we're going to play it again, and I'm doing tactical periodization. And that's just not. Like, it's just that barely scratches the surface of what tactical periodization is. And I think as you go through having now 2.5 years in the course, and a lot of the discussion today will basically be around my interaction with tactical periodization, and from the Portuguese school with Vitor Frade for the last 2.5 years, and not that I am an expert, but it's kind of where I am in my journey, having taken the master's course in tactical periodization, and now just last week finished the teaching for teachers course as an instructor. So I think, to me, the starting point for tactical periodization, interesting enough, is understanding complexity, and I think that's what people right out of the gate miss, is that it is understanding that players themselves are these complex systems, and the way you build a team is a complex system. The way you build a training week has lots of complexity to it, which we'll discuss as we go through. But unless we understand things like nonlinear response to things and complex systems, we're going to have a hard time, I think, understanding tactical periodization and what it is, and the fact that we are, I think, sometimes as North Americans and Northern Europeans, we really value linear thinking. We really value, okay, I know I want to stumble upon this formula where if I do A, I know that B is the outcome. I know that I've done it for 15 years, and I know when my week looks like this is the outcome. When in fact that's not really reality, right? We live in this really kind of dynamic, complex system that's extremely nonlinear response to things. So I think that's the starting point, right? And I think the starting point is that, and one, it's also not, tactical periodization is not how I periodize my tactics. That's also not it. So the starting point is really understanding your players as what they bring physically, cognitively, emotionally, socially to your group, and then how I build my training week, this morpho cycle, they will call it, build this training week after week after week, to have the team arrive and perform at a high level week after week. I think that is the starting point. And again, because we have to look at our players where they're at physically, emotionally, cognitively, or mentally, socially, there's lots of complexity as all those different systems interact with each other. So
the complexity piece is something I've really fascinated about, and I've thought a little bit about this just recently, just in coaching. Tactics, the same thing. You know, is it Pep or Jose, and we're lured towards thinking binary or one or the other in our culture today. But also, I think the history of coaching is that you simplify something. Like the Pele series was all the different techniques, and you practice them and you get better at them and you become a better player. But in reality, as you learn more about the game, the grey increases, and then all of a sudden you've got to navigate around that. So that's how I see complexity, but I see like that's challenging your own thought process. And I guess where you say start with complexity, I mean, how do they shape or frame you as a person understanding or even approaching complexity?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. One of the first things we did in our course is we watched a movie called Mind Walk, which is this basically three people walking through a French beach city discussing politics and the economy and social structures and things like that, just so you understand that there's several systems all interacting with each other that give you outcomes that you don't expect, you know. And it's funny, I love one of Vitor Frade's favorite quotes I have of mine is he has this statement that just always remember, you learn how to swim in the winter. And I love that saying of like, we would love as coaches to feel like, hey, we're playing X team next Saturday. This is how they press. This is how they attack. This is what we're going to do. We do these exercises. We implement it. Boom, we win. But as we know, sometimes you work on some sort of concept and it pops up 3 weeks later, not the next weekend, right? And so that's the linearity of understanding that if I work on something, it may happen. The players may be able to implement it in 3 days, or it might be 3 weeks, or it might be 3 months for whatever reason of where they're at in their development. And so being patient with the process and understanding this whole, again, nonlinear response, you don't know when it's going to pop up. That is part of the process. And that is, I think, at the heart of tactile periodization, where, you know, they have the one of their principles, the principles of complex progression, where over the course of this year, of this, you know, lifetime, you have a group of players, how you're shifting, changing subtly the training sessions. They're able to take on more, you give them more. You're able to build in more complex ideas over the course of your time with these players. Patiently waiting for them to pick things up before you add something different. That is a key piece, I think, to understanding tactile periodization.
You've got different coaching approaches to coach education. Used to be, when I was doing coach education, was you'd almost feel it. Today it seems to be there's the approach of, you know, they adapt to you, which I think we're approaching more in the US of our model. And then from what I'm hearing of some people doing French coach education, it's almost, hey, they're very, very hard on standards of coaching, and they kind of then break you down to build you back up. What's Frade like in terms of challenging you? How is it? Where does it sit in that kind of continuum?
Well, it's funny because I think one of the terms they use that we use consistently within the training for trainers courses is empathic. That as coaches and as teachers of coaches, that you have to have empathy. You know, and I would say, I think, to me, the biggest, hands down, the biggest piece that I gained from my time learning tactile periodization is the role of the emotional in everything. And understanding the emotional component to the player is important. Driving emotions within your training session is super important. Figuring out where the whole group is at emotionally as to what they need within your weekly training is super important. You know, and so I think that's that whole empathetic side, this emotional piece. You know, I think that's the porch, and you feel that. Like, I think it's interesting, you know, taking the first 8 months of the course and understanding, learning these concepts and principles of the actual methodology was super beneficial. But then going there you go there and you feel the emotions of the city, then it's you go to Porto and the emotion of the people comes right through, you know. And it's funny. I actually had my staff watch this the other day. This is fascinating with Mourinho. We were watching a Mourinho leadership video, and they were asking him what he thinks about leadership, how he got to where he was, his starting point. So they asked Mourinho, what's his starting point? You know, tell us about your first memories of the game. And he says, you know, my first memories of the game were sitting in the locker room when my father was coaching, and hearing the voice of coaching players, and smelling the massage oil the guys use before they went on a lotion, and hearing the cleats. And I remember thinking, it's sensing and feeling. Like, his starting point is sensing and feeling, which is really different than what I think the Northern European, Northern American, like, they're starting. Tell us about your experience with soccer. You know, it's and then they ask him about Argentinians. He's had a lot of Argentinian players. What can he say about, as a world champions, Argentina? And he says, you know, they're all different. I had Zanetti. Zanetti is one way. Di Maria is different. They're different types of players, but they come every day to compete, and they understand competing and staying at a certain, having the right competitive energy whenever they step on the field. That's what, you know, makes Argentinians special. And again, that's the emotional piece, that I bring the emotions to compete every day. And I remember thinking, I had my staff watch that and see, that's the sensing, the feeling, the emotions, like, as a starting point to coaching. That's what you pick up from the course, that I think it's not the starting point of this is what we want physically, and this is the demands of what we do physically, and these are the parameters that we have. No, it was this real sensing, feeling, emotions that was the actual starting point.
That's high level stuff. What if you're not good at that? Like, what if you're not you know, if you're a little bit unaware about that, and how can you improve in that area?
I mean, I'm not a psychologist, so maybe I'm speaking out of turn, but I mean, I think we can always, the question is, can we become more empathetic as people and as coaches? And if there has to be a recognition that that's this area we need to work at. As me and you were discussing before, I think what I've picked up on through the course is the coach's ability to develop a sensitivity to his or her team that becomes super critical. And that has a huge emotional component. You know, since then, we've had, you know, some people I've interacted with in the course that have gone to visit Zidane when he was at Real Madrid. And, you know, they went to visit Zidane at Real Madrid, and you know, they came back with, he actually didn't do anything that you haven't seen before. And in fact, some days he'd walk in on him, you know, match day -2, and say, the group's overloaded. We just need to do shooting competition today and be done. Because he had this sensitivity where the group was, you know. And so I think, you know, one of the things that they, you know, discuss in the course is and Professor Frade has discussed as well, is there's two different types of coaches, right? You have the type of coach that is the academic, that is well studied, that has learned the craft of coaching, that has a scientific underpinning to everything they do. And then you do have the intuitive ex-player that is so finely attuned to themselves and to the team, and that is, let's say now, Ancelotti, where the players love him, and he has a connection with the players, you know, in part because he understands where they're at on a daily basis. And you can get that sensitivity, I think, from either way. You can create that sensitivity by understanding the scientific underpinnings of, you know, the neuroscience and learning styles and decision-making structures. Or you can be the ex-player that has a super fine attunement to where their team is at. And so, yeah, I think you can learn through both kind of mechanisms, depending on the type of coach, where your starting point as a coach is.
Yeah, I definitely think that I've seen that in action. Someone with high levels of intuition walk into a room and sense, feel, and move almost in a different way than what the meeting was going to be 5 minutes before that. But I guess my question would be, do you think we then overvalue the first one, where it's like learn, study, the game model, the periodization model, physical model will take you there, so ease off on the intuition? Do you think one kind of overrides the other in our North American culture slightly?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the linear thinking piece. Is that we're all out looking for this formula for success, and and again, it doesn't matter. I don't think, because we see this in other sports. I mean, Steve, Phil Jackson is the best example of this. Kind of fine attunement to his team. Steve Kerr is like that now. Like you do see that in other sports of, but that doesn't mean that. Let's say if you haven't been blessed with those sorts of experiences, you can learn through this, I think, scientific underpinning as well, right? Like I think it's one of the things that we studied within the tactile periodization course is Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast, Thinking Slow, Antonio Damasio's neuroscience books is part of the readings of the book, in this sensing, feeling, emotions, understanding the difference between feelings and emotions, understanding, Damasio has this saying that we are feeling beings that think, we're not thinking beings that feel. Like our starting point is feeling. And again, when we go out and when we see really, really top class players do things, and you ask them like, "Oh, how'd you do that?" Like, "Well, I don't know. I didn't even think about it." There's a great kind of little reel with Luka Doncic that went, viral a couple months ago, where Luka Doncic does this little step to the basket, puts the guy, off balance and goes up and just, puts his easy layup in. And they ask him, "How'd you learn to do that?" And he just says, I don't know. I try to teach my teammates how to do it, but I actually can't teach them because I don't really know how I do it, and there's an element of feeling that goes above and beyond the thinking aspect of the game that I think is also misunderstood and misrepresented, and that goes back to what we do in the game consciously versus unconsciously, and again, this is some of the neuroscience underpinning of tactile periodization, is that how do we develop the ability to act unconsciously through recognizing patterns, and they may not actually think about things by doing similar various exercises time after time after time after time, right? And I think that then builds in, you might talk about the fluidity of your team. I think that's another concept. You think very heavily in tactile periodization. Ultimately, you want a game model. You want to create fluidity within your game model, right? And fluidity means there's this understanding in the interactions between players, with them not really having to think overly consciously about things. And how do you create that? So, yeah, and these are all scientific frameworks as well. So you can get it intuitively, but I do think that as coaches, we can study these things and learn them, and that's why a school like the Tactile Periodization School has developed.
Yeah, I see that a lot with, I actually started collecting them a couple of years ago. If I saw an interview where a player said they didn't remember something, even saw one actually, Olympic semi-finals, Sophia Smith scored the winner, was asked to describe it. She said, "I don't know, just went blank. Mine just went blank." Yeah. And I think the more we hear that, or even the more we're aware of that, then it should actually challenge us, that players don't instantly recall every single moment of every, even really high valuable moments.
Yeah. And that goes back to the Kahneman. I mean, and that's why we studied, some of the Kahneman thinking fast versus thinking slow. And again, as North Americans and Northern Europeans, we value the thinking slow. We value this tremendous amount of, processing around things and thinking deeply and considering all the consequences, going through a if-then checklist in our head as we make decisions. But obviously that's not our sport. In our sport, we receive the ball, we get pressured, we have to make a decision, we have to make the right decision with very limited time and information. Boom, we've got to go, right? And so how do we optimize our fast decision-making framework, if we're using Kahneman's framework to do that, and understanding what type of exercises elicit that, and also how we coach within exercises to elicit that.
Hello coaches, we'll take a quick break here. If you enjoy the Modern Soccer Coach content and you would like to help keep growing the content, you can do so in two ways. One, you can follow us and help promote everything that's going out. That's one massive way of helping Modern Soccer Coach, again, grow more traction online, get more views and improve the product and grow the volume of content we're doing. And then second of all, you can head on over to modernsoccercoach.com where we have a ton of free information. We've also got some premium content around the Modern Soccer Coach analysis course, which is on modernsoccercoach.com/analysis. We also have a ton of ebooks as well. If you enjoy it, if this is something that benefits you as a coach and you want to help grow it and help support it, please head on over to modernsoccercoach.com/shop. Thank you so much for the support. Again, just a reminder to subscribe. Thank you so much for the support. We will continue to grow. We will continue to try and make it as high quality as possible with guests like David. And we've got some phenomenal insight coming in the next few weeks. Please make sure you don't miss it. Thank you for the support. Back to David.
Yeah, that actually brings us along nicely to the conscious piece, where some reading that I've done around tactical periodization, I've based some of these questions on. An important piece seems to be this: players, quote unquote, know about their know. Like, players have to know the why, which you hear again in North American culture. But what I wanted to ask was, how deep does this go on the player's education side? Is it the player is aware of every single sub-principle, sub-principle, or is it more kind of macro, player is aware of why we're doing something, let's go with it? Or how does that work?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think there's different, I don't know exactly when within tactical periodization they kind of moved from this sub-principle to now more having the discussion of macro, meso, micro principles. But I think from a language perspective, they've used just more the terms micro, macro, meso principles. And I think within tactile periodization, there's this constant series of dualities, I think, that exist, right? And one of the dualities is the individual versus collective, right? And so I think within your collective behaviors, there's probably lots of discussion from the team that's really driving your macro principles of your game model. Is this very structured game model ideas that the coach might bring with them. That also gets to this, maybe we can discuss the difference of game idea versus game model in a bit, but coach brings this kind of game model. And yes, I do think there's probably a conscious understanding of this is how we want to play. But the more you shift from the macro, the meso, the micro, your micro principles, there has to be some automatic reactions and unconscious things trained within your micro principles. And I think, one of the best delivers of, tactile periodization information in the last couple of years has been, Pep Linders with Liverpool. And they'll talk a lot about their pressing cues. And you don't have time to think about like, oh, the team is doing this, now we press. It's this instant response of, okay, we lose the ball, we press to win it back. And again, going back to the discussion around emotional, cognitive, physical, there's a physical aspect of wanting to press. It's probably more of an unconscious reaction to go press. And then within the training sessions, this emotional feeling of aggression of when we lose the ball emotionally, there's going to be this aggression to go win it back. And I think one of the things that I didn't say probably in the beginning I should have is that as we talk about coaching, and then also on the sports science side, is that when you have this physical, cognitive, or mental, emotional, oftentimes we as coaches want to separate them, right? And I think one of the things Vitor Friday talks about is that he calls this unbreakable wholeness. You cannot separate them. When we talk about Liverpool pressing under Klopp, there's a physical element, there's a consciousness or unconsciousness element, and there's the emotional element. You cannot separate them. We want to separate them. It would be really nice if we could separate them, but you can't. So yeah, as we get into pressing the ball, breaking the next line, what's happening in front of us, going back like to the Luka Doncic idea, the really 1v1 micro principle based concepts are probably tend to be less conscious than unconscious,
which makes it more complicated for coaches.
Or complex. Yeah.
The piece there you talk about game model versus game idea, and that's something where, again, complexity of, like, when we think of a school of coaching, generally we think of everyone doing the same thing, and eventually, I think tactics have become this in North America. In my experience, have been reviewing game models. How many different ways. If nobody's going to be direct and say that on a presentation, like everyone's going to be progressive with possession and use all these terms. And again, I think it leads to groupthink a little bit. But when I look at tactical periodization, I see so much evolution in it and different areas in it. And I wonder how you can have that, again, complexity question, how can you have that kind of consistency of principles or frameworks, but then variations in how to do it?
Yeah, because but the reality is you can utilize tactical periodization at a very, very high level. One coach can use tactical periodization at a very high level and have one sort of game model. We're going to be defensively very solid and we're going to break teams in transition, or you can have Pep Linders with Klopp with Liverpool saying we're going to utilize principles of tactical periodization and we're going to go press teams and our game model is going to be very aggressive and it's going to be in their half. You're both using tactical periodization. So the game model is irrelevant in terms of using tactical periodization. Tactical periodization is an approach to how you teach your team and how you build a morphocycle over the week. How you arrive at the game. At 21, one of the exercises we did in the master's course was we had a discussion around what does pragmatism mean? If someone says we want to play pragmatically, is that good or is that not good? Because lots of negative connotations around being pragmatic, and one of the discussions around Mourinho would talk about pragmatism a lot, and he was oftentimes criticized for being a pragmatic coach, but they would say that pragmatic just means I choose a game model or game style that allows me to get in front of the opponent's goal more than they get in front of our goal. That's all pragmatism is. We want to arrive in front of the opponent's goal more than they arrive in front of our goal. And what is the best way to choose to play to have that? And when you think of it like that, you're like, oh, well, that just makes sense. Like there's nothing, there's no negativity around that. And it could be we want to press the opponent and smother them and win the ball back in front of their goal as often as possible, or we're going to sit and only concede from distance, and they're going to come forward and make a lot of space behind their back line, and we are going to take huge advantage of that when we win the ball because we have a certain type of player that can do that. Either way, you're just being pragmatic and choosing the best game model for whatever team you have.
Yeah, another interesting area that I've read about is this emotional overload or a sensory overload with players, and using that it seems to be just as important as the physical metric. But then, of course, even I know that can you measure that there? I mean, how does that dynamic work where, again, you're choosing a school of thought or a framework which has an abundance of information? So is there a temptation to overload players, or how do you stop yourself from doing that, or how does that work?
Yeah. I mean, I think what happens is we, again, as North Americans or Northern Europeans, I think we value what we can measure more than we value what we can't measure, right? And that's why we've ended up where we're at. That's why, let's be really honest. If we shift this to a little more of a sports science slant as well, we can measure more now physically than we've ever been able to measure. We also continue to have injuries across Champions League football, MLS football, world football. We've had an consistent increase in injuries despite the fact that we can measure and monitor everything and have bigger staffs and bigger infrastructures. We've invested more on that side than we ever have. and yet injuries still increase. And yes, people talk about, well, there's more games, and well, the game's gotten faster, and there are a group of teams that are playing more games potentially, but we're also allocating so many more resources towards all of this as well as saying more. So then can we lead ourselves to think about, we're not measuring something that has a lot of value that's causing fatigue. And maybe it's emotional, maybe it's cognitive, maybe it's, again, you can't separate, going back to the example, you can't separate them, right? So how do you think about how you determine how much you coach, how much you work, how much you value the physical, how much you have the emotional, the mental, cognitive, and then that goes back to the discussion of the sensitivity piece. Right? I think being able to really look at the data, but then also connect with your team, understand signs of mental fatigue, emotional fatigue. As an example, one of the things we have now in Austin, we've really, I think, noticed more than anything is that, we have a very defined game model. We ask the players to train with intensity. We give them lots of information training. And it's funny, now there's days it's 100 degrees, by the end of training. And the players, they can get really grumpy. And we look at the end of training and we'll say, well, yeah, if you drive the physical and you drive the cognitive, what's going to happen to the emotional? You see the impact on the emotions, right? And so that's a natural consequence. Like, we have to be patient, okay, that sometimes the players can get grumpy because it's 100 degrees. So emotionally, what happens when it's 100 degrees? And then you're giving them lots of information cognitively, and then you're actually driving the physical intensity of training, and you see the interconnectedness of those three really, really clearly, and you end up with a group that now emotionally, then in training, like emotionally, they're exhausted. Now, you haven't necessarily purposely tried to drive the emotions with a training session, but the consequence of a session with a high physical output with lots of cognitive processing demand also affects the emotional side. And I think over time, and then this is, again, I think with the sensitivity piece, I think this is something that we're sensitive to far more now than we were 3 to 4 years ago. So that's that development of that sensitivity piece of the coach.
Yeah. Every question I'm asking you, I kind of know that it's going to be the complexity part. But when you put that into, all right, they're going to be overloaded in a unique landscape like North American professional sports, where travel MLS is insane. Travel NBA is it feels like nine months on the road. Colleges now are starting their season up where they're on the, so I guess my question is how do you know what's tactical overload and how you know what's general fatigue when I took two flights to get here?
Yeah. Or you can say, like, but it doesn't matter, does it? Like, it doesn't truly matter if it's, I overload them cognitively because I gave them lots of tactical information in the game, or they're emotionally tired. I think that goes back to like not wanting or needing to separate them. It truly doesn't matter.
They're the same thing.
It ends up with fatigue, right?
Yeah.
So you have to I think the point is you have to respect the fatigue, no matter, and that's where again, going back to the sensitivity of the coaches, it's you create these training sessions, and you can't say like, well, okay, I think one of the things we can slip into as well in the intensity side. What does intensity mean? Right? Intensity can mean lots of different things. And if you provide lots of intensity through your coaching, you will have fatigue. And at the end of the day, you can say, well, physically it wasn't that bad. How many times I've worked with coaches in the past where, they've given information, they've wanted lots of aggression training, but maybe there's not a ton of running per se, but they've demanded a lot of the group. And then they'll look at me and say, well, Dave, that wasn't that hard. I mean, look at the GPS. Like, they didn't actually run that much. And you'll say, well, no, that was there's fatigue from that session. The GPS numbers will not show that necessarily today, but there is fatigue.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the things, a couple weeks ago, you had, there was a podcast with Darcy Norman and Tony Strudwick on, right? And Tony Strudwick made mention of this concept of the changing demands of the game, and us talking about how the games, games are faster. Yes, games are faster. There's more injuries. Yeah. And wanting to say, well, it's more games and more running in games. Except as and I love Tony's point, training sessions today are not the same as training sessions 15 years ago. And training sessions 15 years ago where we do a nice little warm up, and then we maybe play some 5v2, and then maybe we'll do a little rondo, and then we'll do a small sided game, whatever, 5v5, 8v8. Then we might practice some set plays, and we call it a day. And then today, with a lot of the functional sessions, and especially if you're with a coach that uses positional play, where, hey, we could be working on overloads in wide areas. We could be a pressing type session. And we're going to repeat these tactical decisions over and over and over within this functional session. And now our high-speed running might be low. Our sprint distance might be low. But there's a repetition. There's a density of high XLs and decels, along with this emotional demand of intensity that has a significant load, and far more load and will create fatigue relative to those sessions 15 years ago we're talking about. And we're not talking about that much. We're not talking about the differences in the way teams want to train today and the impact on creation of fatigue on athletes today.
Do you think that's dropped because of injury? I suppose not prevention, but people being worried about injury, where they feel as if they can control that through, okay, it's got to be a moderate training today from a science point of view.
I mean, I think what I liked in that podcast with Tony, Tony talked about the need to question a lot of the conventional GPS metrics of things like total distance and total high-speed running, total sprint distance, that are we exposing the players to things that we're just not picking up with those conventional GPS metrics? And I actually personally think that on top of what Tony's talking about, we still have sports science people that say, okay, well, today I won a session with 6,000 meters and 800 meters of high-speed running and a little bit of exposure sprint distance, without actually thinking about the demand of these really tight tactical positional play sessions. And then we think that we're creating an injury prevention process by having this running over top. We're getting high speed exposure to things, but our players may easily be fatigued before we even get there. And I think that's one of the issues more than anything.
Yeah. As with science, I feel as if science is now just fairly accepted with GPS and the monitoring aspect of it in most environments today. But I think we're also loading up. The analysis community has grown in the last 5 years. So now a player's coming in the morning, generally if they're carrying something, which most senior players are carrying something and having a discussion about it, then they're getting into a tactical discussion for 30 minutes, then maybe an individual discussion about something, then leading to a training session. So would it be a case-by-case basis that you would monitor that there? Or are there telltale signs that you kind of pick up that, hey, listen, this player's overloaded, or this player's just physically okay, but mentally needs a break?
Yeah, I think there's a few pieces of technology and sports science that we can use. And again, I think if at the end of the day, it comes down to, do you as a performance sports science medical staff have a good enough relationship with the players to pull out, hey, I'm mentally overloaded? I also think that it's really important, and part of my role, here within Austin, is to teach most of my staff about this tactical periodization, about this complexity. And my sports scientist now, he's he's past the fact of like asking questions, and I kind of give him this look, and he's like, I know it's complex, and it's which he got tired of, and he'll say, I used to love being a linear thinker, but I understand you actually can't be a linear thinker anymore, because there is the interaction of the mental and the emotional with everything else, that you have to have that discussion as a medical performance staff as well. And then part of my role is to be able to provide feedback to the coaches to say, I think to your point, hey, there's fatigue. Well, are they physically fatigued or are they mentally fatigued? Where there's a point where it really doesn't matter. If they're fatigued, they're fatigued. And again, there's talking about the dualities. Tactile periodization has, like I said, a series of dualities, binomials, in this case, trinomials of this performance, fatigue, recovery. You're constantly in this balance between fatigue and recovery. You have to produce fatigue to create fitness and performance. So it's necessary to create fatigue. We can't look at fatigue as a bad thing, but you need the team to arrive on Saturday or Sunday in a fresh state. Freshness is key, emotional just as much as physical. So how do you do that? And you have to be aware of fatigue, what type of fatigue it might be, and then what's the best ways to create that freshness and recovery over the course of the week. But that discussion amongst your entire medical performance coaching staff between understanding fitness, freshness, fatigue is super important. And you can do things like wellness surveys. We can use technology like heart rate variability. We have discussions. You need that connection, but ultimately you have to have that connection with the players so they pass on the sense of, I'm just exhausted. And again, it comes back to the sensitivity. We all have to be sensitive to understanding the players, where they're coming from, and being able to communicate that back to the head coach. And then we arrive at a training cycle, a morpho cycle that is appropriate for the players for that week.
Yeah, I actually made me think. I watched a review show last night with Jamie Redknapp. He pointed out that with the Sterling incident yesterday, Chelsea seemed to solve a freshness and physical performance issue by loading up on 30 players that they could just rotate. But now they realize that it doesn't. You give yourself, you trade off another problem.
Yeah, there's probably a trade-off in fluidity. You're losing fluidity because you don't have the training interactions that you need to. You'll have fresh players with not a lot of fluidity potentially. But
yeah, do you think we're seeing that today, or is this just my not imagination, but like, have I a bias where I feel as if the best teams are there's a lot of consistency in starting 11s, and because of that relationship aspect of it?
Yeah, I think that's, again, going back to this concept of collective versus individual, and the more time that you spend in the collective and building, and that's not rocket science, building interactions and training time together in your collective session, then the more fluidity there'll be in the game. And it's funny because I think one of the things that Professor Friday can be very provocative. Like there's a lot of provocative parts within tactile periodization, and one of the provocative things he says is, you really only train one time a week, and that's your match day -3. Because let's say you play Saturday, on Sunday maybe you'll do a recovery, on Tuesday you might come in, you're still not fully recovered, especially as you age and get a little bit older. On Saturday you're still not fully recovered by Tuesday. By Wednesday, you're fully recovered. So Wednesday is the only day that you can truly do whatever you want to from a collective. Now that probably needs to be a real collective session that again, the sports science side would say, oh, you're working in big spaces, we're getting high velocities, we're getting high speed running. But at the end of the day, you're getting you're training the collective. And maybe it's 11v11, maybe it's 9v9 plus 1. It doesn't have to necessarily be 11v11. And some teams may never have enough to do 11v11. But but it's the day when you can come the closest to your game stimulus. And you must utilize that as best as possible. And then once you get into Thursday, now you can't work in game-like conditions because now you're starting to try to create freshness for the game.
But one thing there I wanted to ask was on this piece of, again, the interactions and even the repetition, seems like tactical periodization would encourage you to be repetitive with getting things right and staying on task with something, but at the same time that could chip away at game realism.
Yeah.
If it is for example, I remember years ago I got in to watch Man United train, and Van Gaal was taking it, and I thought it was the longest exercise I ever sat through in my life. It was about 35 minutes, and it was just like a 4v3 wide overload, fullback playing in and over to, and I was thinking naively probably was like, oh, this is chipping away at the realism every single. I guess, how does that duality work? Is that the right question? Or?
Yeah, that duality is redundancy versus variability, right? So I think we're always working in this concept of there's something the players have some familiarity with, but there's a little bit different nuance or feel to it. So you're always working in this redundancy versus variability. And even as simple as like the warm-up, like we would strive within the warm-up period of every training session. Nothing is quite the same. It's always, I remember, normally when I would get someone in to kind of work under me, one of their first observations is, this is kind of like yesterday's warm-up, but it's a little bit different. And the next day is kind of like what we've done before, but it's always a little bit different. Because again, you have a player for how many training sessions? 200 training sessions a year. They have to feel something a little bit different through the first part of the training session every single day, because there's an emotional staleness, which then becomes physically stale if it feels the same, right? So this goes back to this sensing feeling. It must feel slightly different. We're always working on this variability versus redundancy concept. And then the players come out and I think they will look forward to the training session every day if they feel like something is going to be different every day. But there's always this feeling of familiarity, and then as coaches, you always have your biggest concern when you're doing something that's totally different that they're not familiar with at all. Because there is always, again, we talk about psychological safety, there's going to be a sense of threat for doing an exercise you've never ever done before. And if it doesn't work, what are they going to think? And so that's why you have the duality of redundancy versus variability.
Oh, very, very interesting. Very interesting. Is there not another complexity again? But you're then at the risk, if you do something new every day, then you're adding to the overload, perhaps.
Yeah.
If it's
you need to challenge you're challenging them cognitively, but striving for some sense of, well, again, you're managing the emotions, right? Because you're trying to drive, we should be creating the environment where we're asking them to problem solve on a daily basis. And if they solve the same problem over and over and over again, that gets boring. If there's something that's too hard for them to solve, they give up, right? It's kind of like dealing with kids as well, right? So you're giving them something they can solve, but there's always some sort of challenge. And I think most players, I think that's why it's interesting. Most players that come from Brazil, Argentina, even Spain, Portugal, they've grown up playing. They want to play. They want to solve problems. And even as early as the warm up and rondo, you want to provide something that is a new problem they've never had to solve before. Right? It's funny because sometimes I'll see, if we do the same passing exercise we've always done, maybe we repeat a passing exercise we've always done. You can always tell that sometimes the Argentinians, they're kind of bored with it, so they play these passes. They try to just screw up the next player just because they have to make a game out of it. and that's what makes them special. They're special problem solvers, and then sometimes they like giving hard problems to their teammates around them for fun, and you have to embrace that too. So rather than having them screw up your passing exercise because they're bored with it, how do you engage with them where it's something a little bit different they haven't thought about before?
You've obviously got a wide range of experience and knowledge in all the different areas here, different levels here in the US. If you would see one or maybe two or three things that you would change from your experience and understanding in tactical periodization that we could add to our soccer specific sports science community, rather than sending them to, well, maybe we should do this, send everyone to Portugal and have them upskilling out there. But say we couldn't do that. Say it's like, all right, listen, if we just tested ourselves in this area or challenge this stuff, where would you focus on?
I mean, I think clearly the whole cognitive processing piece and how players make decisions, and if we look at the very, very best players in the world, it goes back to what I just said. They're amazing problem solvers. And part of that comes from them being, street footballers from where they came from, and not underestimating that. But they, especially young players, like, they need to play and they need to solve things with the physical tools, the physical and cognitive tools they have, and be given an environment to generate curiosity in. I think that's the other piece to tactical periodization, where they're very big on, is generating curiosity. And every training session should have this element of generating curiosity. And the best players and the best coaches tend to be really curious people. And so we must facilitate an environment to generate curiosity. And sometimes we as coaches want to provide information. We want to prepare teams for the games. We, in our zeal and zest to want to give players the answers, we stop generating curiosity. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes we can make.
Brilliant. Love that. See the NBA landscape, where sometimes I feel sports are 10 years ahead of where we are. Maybe they're not, or maybe in terms of technology they were. And it seems to have. I've read a few books. I actually reading one on the Cavs at the minute. Read the Golden State one, and all these environments seem to have really high levels of specialization and support, and being part of that there. Do you think basketball is ahead of us with the integration, or do you still think NBA environments are challenged in that area?
I think it's mixed. I don't know. I think going back to this duality of individual to collective, there's a lot more focus on the individual in the NBA, in part because the teams are just smaller and staffs are bigger. And so you have the opportunity to work more on the individual. Once you're in season, it becomes actually harder to have lots of collective sessions because you're playing, recovering. But I do think what they do a really good job of is having 3 assistant coaches, like assistant coach, 2 or 3, younger assistants or interns out within their game model, building some little specific interactions that will happen in the game and training them over and over and over. I also think that because there's lots of big players and big personalities in the NBA, they figured out how to manage big players. I think, there's so much of Ancelotti that's similar to Phil Jackson, and Phil Jackson was, 20 years ago, and now, Ancelotti has a lot of the same, making everything feel very player-led, not overcoaching. You sense a lot of the same things. I think Steve Kerr, again, like I mentioned, has come out of that, played under Phil Jackson, and maybe it's just that Michael Jordan was so big, and now you've had Michael Jordan and Kobe Bryant, and you've got these really, really big players that drive teams. What is the role of the coach versus the player? It's interesting. I even read something, just a couple of days ago about Pochettino and what might be different about Pochettino, And he said, well, he had to coach at PSG, where he realized where the coach was relative to the top players. And you have, again, a team like PSG that, okay, they won the French league, but, within Europe never quite seemed to push on and have the big successes. We've heard talks about prior to Ancelotti with Real Madrid. I mean, with the Galacticos and Real Madrid, there were many years where they didn't necessarily win the league. They didn't win the big titles because big players are really hard to manage. And I think within the NBA, I think they're a little bit ahead of in that respect, in part because they've had to. So.
Yeah, I just watched that Neymar documentary about a month ago, and that's the first thing I thought of was, how would you manage this guy? Yeah, unbelievable. And now he's got basically three of them. Very, very interesting. Last couple for you. The other thing is the experience of education, which again I question because I see it changing where it's becoming more of a process, coach education, which I think is a good rather than an event. Make it a little bit more immersive. Even fascinated when I spoke to Raymond Verheyen about okay, well, he's got a reputation. Of course, he splits opinion in a number of different ways, but I think he definitely impacts his physical environment when coaches are there. I've heard of so much of the philosophy, so much of read so much about it, but what makes Vitor Frade such an unbelievable coach educator, do you think?
I think there's a depth that he takes understanding the game, understanding how to coach far deeper than most places that I've been before. I do feel like as we've evolved, there's an understanding of complexity and complex systems that you have to work at a high level. And he embraces that from the very first minute. I think he's purposely provocative in how he does things. He challenges people to change the way they think. I think there's a community of people that have embraced this approach. Because I think also what's interesting about tactile periodization is, Professor Frade has been retired for a few years, but there's a series of Portuguese coaches that, not just Portuguese, you obviously have someone like Pep Linders as well that have taken on some of these concepts, and there's this culture of tactile periodization, and it's evolving. And like I said, it doesn't matter if you're high pressing or you're low block. It's how you think and how you structure things. It's not dogmatic. It's literally the way changes the way you think. But then as new science comes out to understand decision-making frameworks, cognitive processing, metabolic adaptation to training, the methodology subtly shifts and changes. The methodology in and of itself is complex. It is changing and shifting as the game changes and as science improves. And I think that's what is really, really nice about it.
I look at coach education as how by the time you write that, even a PDF ebook on it, game's now 2 years ahead in that. But how has tactical periodization managed to again stay flexible with approaches or stay up to date or modern? Is it carried by the community that are constantly tapping into it, or how does that?
I think there's some tremendous teachers. Felipe Moret is the one that's in charge, and Mara Vieira in charge of the company. Super bright people, both of them. But Miguel Lopes, who's now coaching in Porto, and George Reich, who's has worked in Barcelona, China, some different places. Just top class practitioners who tie in, or teachers, educators who tie in the top coaches using the methodology. We've had, for the last 3 years, you had Pep Linders and Vitor Matos from Liverpool come basically walk through what they're doing in Liverpool, which is just a tremendous experience to have available. How the methodologies change with their, what they were able to do with Jurgen Klopp in Liverpool. And now the two of them are both at Salzburg, Red Bull Salzburg. So we'll see how that plays out. And they've got a really good sense of creating community. And then I think it's about, again, if you understand this complexity of these different pieces and you understand what's happening, what's actually happening within your game, right? And I think that's because, yes, the game is changing. We look at the game demands are changing, and that has a physical component. There's a technical component to that. There's a emotional, cognitive component to that. Once you have the tools to assess what's happening physically, what's happening technically, what's happening from a decision-making and processing standpoint, you can start, I think, piecing together how best to work with your group each and every week. Right? Once you have the principles in place, the framework of how you see coaching and training, then the game will continue to change, but you will be able to adjust how you do things along with it. Like we were saying before, like the way we're training is so different, and now all of a sudden, okay, how we're using GPS has suddenly changed, because how we're using GPS technology and sports science technology, it can't be the same as 10 years ago. Like it can't, because how we're training is different, so we have to capture different things. But once you understand that and look at that, and it took us time, you have to let go of what you're doing 10 years ago and change what you're doing subtly right now to provide good feedback to the coaches. So the head coach understands, okay, as we're changing how and even we're not training the same way we trained 4 years ago when we started in Austin, but I think we're better able to convey to the head coach now, this is what's actually happening in our training sessions in a far clearer way to understand how we continue to build week after week of these morphocycles.
I almost feel like tactical periodization is a great term from a brand, and obviously the brand is built now, but it almost doesn't do the topic. It's almost a not interpretation, but it almost doesn't do the overall themes justice, because the tactics tell you exactly what you said at the start. Tactical periodization, I think the phrase used was it's not planning tactical.
Yeah, it's not periodizing tactics.
There you go.
Yeah.
But that's where I think the disconnect here is in North America. Is that it maybe doesn't do it justice, where again it's almost challenges you to this holistic piece. That's where it seems to be really the gold is.
Yeah, and I think there's an openness, but I will say within North America, I think there's an openness to some of these things, and tactical periodization is going to have its first U.S. course in Dallas, and a lot of the masters, a larger percentage of the master's course every year has Americans in it.
Yeah.
So I think there's an openness, and I think once people walk through the door and they see that it's not about this is how you build your game model, and this is how you define your game model, and this is the exercises you do on your game model. No, it's not. It's far more than just that, but you have to get in and see it first. And I also think they've done a good job in exposing English language, because I think there was a point where, when I entered this, you look at what's happening in Spain and what's happening in Portugal, and you're thinking, okay, a lot of these coaches are going to the Premier League. They're Spanish or they're Portuguese, like all of them. Mm-hmm. What are they doing that's different? They're clearly doing something that's different. And it just so happened that the tactical periodization masters in English was, I think, the development of that from the business side was ahead of where anything out of Spain. You have the MBP course in Spain, maybe, but to me, the tactical periodization had the best educational structure in the English language. And so they've continued to build that out as well. So I think once people learn it, they see what it is versus what it's not. But you are right that it's as it started, it was very provocative from Professor Friday to say that, but and it was kind of a way to create a narrative different than the Eastern European periodization, which when Professor Friday started in the 80s and 90s was kind of more dominant. The Soviet periodization, so we're going to call it tactical periodization, so people know that it's not this Soviet periodization that people are following.
Yeah, it's not, you just don't arrive and get a template of a calendar that you put in your training sessions. Yeah. It is interesting. The Mourinho, I've always been a big Mourinho fan. That's probably what drew me to it initially. But I think it's interesting with what you're saying, and then thinking about even Rui Faria, Villas-Boas. These were all people who were different parts of his initial staff, scouting sport, and they all became managers as well. Portugal. So I also think that something about the culture over there in Spain as well, thinking about football, they think about it a little bit deeper, a little differently.
Yeah. I think there's their view on education and society, and there's a depth to everything they do, and that's what I think I didn't appreciate it until I truly went over there, and saw the people, and again, I think they see the world in this very holistic way, and again, I think they embrace complexity within what they do culturally in a way that we just don't. I think that was one of my takeaways. I'm like, wow, we love linear thinking in the US. We love it. We just want, if I do A, I know I'm going to get B. Like, we love that. And I think Spain and Portugal, they just understand that's just not true. And, I think that's a starting point of us accepting that we are a society that embraces linear thinking more than anything else.
Oh, that could be a separate podcast, Dave, that there, because that's the linear thinking is even from every dollar someone puts into soccer, parents, investors, they want $5 back. And I think in Europe, there's 100 things wrong with European landscape in the UK where I brought up, but this acceptance that you're going to make money back off football is not there. But it's over here, it's here. And I think that leads to short-termism in terms of, all right, we've got to execute everything today, which then has a knock-on effect of 500 things that offsets, which are problems.
Yeah. Again, it's there's lots of things interacting with each other as we do things in the soccer world, and I think it's understanding all those mechanisms and the interactions, the relationships that will drive us, and I think that's what I see in the top level. Top level coaches are able to do that in a way that separates them from the average coach.
Brilliant. David, thank you so much. I've wasted an extra 25 minutes of your time here, but the conversation was too good. I was loving this here. Thank you. Amazing.
I appreciate you having me on again, and it was a great discussion. Thank you.